We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Subscribe and follow wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. You can also find the podcast on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, where you get videos weekly. Links to all the social media sites at bookedonrock.com. Charles F. Rosenay is our guest to talk about his new book, The Book of Top 10 Beatles Lists. Most people have a favorite Beatles song. In fact, most people grew up having a favorite Beatle. In this book, 64 celebrities and Beatles associates reveal their top 10 favorite Beatles songs, albums, themes, and memories. Charles is well known to Beatles fans for over 4 decades of promoting conventions, festivals, and events. Since 1983, he's hosted the Magical Mystery Tour to London and Liverpool during Beatle Week, an event which brings travelers on the ultimate fan experience. For almost 20 years, he was the publisher and editor of the world-famous Beatles magazine Good Day Sunshine. After years of contacting celebrities, rock stars, actors, athletes, authors, and notables connected to the Beatles' history, Charles has put together this book for pop culture enthusiasts, music lovers, and fans of the greatest rock and roll band in history, the Beatles. I put together my own top 10 Beatles song list, which you can link up to through the show notes page. I'd love to hear what your top 10 list is. Look for this episode and post yours on the Booked on Rock Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages, or by email, thebookedonrockpodcast at gmail.com. Would love to hear what you come up with for your top 10 Beatles songs list. Before you come up with your top 10, though, let's hear from Charles F. Rosenay. Hi, Charles. Welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here, Eric.
Before we get into the book, can you talk about your background in Beatles history? This is quite a career.
Well, you know, I have 2 first memories in life. One was seeing Bride of Frankenstein on TV with my mom, and then seeing the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. And both of those really impacted my life because I always wanted to be somehow involved in monster movies and somehow involved in, rock and roll. Became a Beatles producer for festivals and conventions and all that cool stuff. Published a magazine on the Beatles for 20 years. Have been in a ton of monster movies and shorts. And as you know, the reason I'm probably on the show is because I've written a few books recently. One was the book of top 10 horror lists, and now the brand new book of top 10 Beatle lists. So it all started at, there's this little punky kid who was a nerd and like so many others was a monster kid and a Beatles kid, and somehow grew up to make my hobbies my life in many ways.
And you do a tour for Beatles fans, right?
Since '83, this is our 40th anniversary of bringing fans to London and Liverpool during Beatle Week, which is every year in August. And we take the Magical History Tour, which I not only organize, but I host. And it's the ultimate. If you're a sincere Beatles fan and you've been to conventions and you've been to see McCartney, the ultimate is going to follow in the footsteps of the Beatles. And we do that every single year. LiverpoolTours.com. Thousands of fans have come and have the greatest time of their life.
And you have met the man himself, Paul McCartney. I was just listening to an interview with Kip Winger, and he said, that's a guy I've never met. He goes, he's the only guy who's influenced every musician that's on the planet. So let me ask you, what is it like to meet Paul? When did you first meet him? How many times have you got to talk with him?
Yeah, fortunate enough to, meet him a bunch of times. The first time was backstage when he'd started his tours again, and it was at the NEC in Birmingham, England. And it was one of those drooling moments, the blubber where the mouth is working, but you're not sure what you're saying and how much you mean to me and what you've, done for all the fans through the years. I can't begin to thank you. Yeah, that's cool. What was funnier was that I was introduced as, okay, this is the guy who produces, Beatles conventions in America. And Paul goes, oh, that's cool. And this is the guy who publishes Good Day Sunshine, the Beatles magazine. Oh, good title, that. And he's also the guy who brings Beatle fans to Liverpool every summer on Beatle tours. And Paul goes, oh, when am I going to get my royalties? So He broke the ice.
Yeah.
That was fun. And met on other occasions, but that was the one, of obviously I never thought I would. I think it was prior to that, a few years prior to that, I had met the Monkees. I'd met Peter, Mickey, and Davey when they were rehearsing to start their reunion tour. And I thought, okay, my second favorite group of all time. This is it. I'm never gonna, go above that. And of course, getting to meet Paul, getting to ask, Ringo questions, getting to meet George Harrison in an airport, all those things, were just life dreams come true, and probably led to the continuation of my fascination and my love of the Beatles and all the things I've done.
What I always get the sense with Paul is that he could fill a room up with positive energy. Is that the kind of vibe you get around him?
Oh,
Like just
absolutely.
a happy guy.
I mean, I saw him recently at Yale University. He was at Woolsey Hall, and he was doing a Q&A for a book called Lyrics, and just that whole room and the energy. It was just everyone riding on every word, every smile, every head gesture, every twinkle, every eye up in the air. Yeah, I mean, who could, for years, people would say you go around the world and everybody on every planet, whether it's Mexico, Canada, the Sudan, whatever, knew Muhammad Ali. And that was probably true. And in many cases, probably the next person to that is probably, Paul McCartney around the world. And the influence and the joy he's brought is just unsurpassed.
So let's talk about the book. You write in the introduction about how you would never write a Beatles book because you basically cover them extensively every month in your magazine, Good Day Sunshine. Plus, you figured every topic has been covered, right? Not so. Can you talk about how the downtime from COVID inspired the idea for this book, the book of top 10 Beatles lists?
Yeah. So, COVID was a horrible, horrible thing. And let's, bless all the people who made through it, and sad for the people who lost people and got sick from it. It was the bright side of it for me, making lemonade out of lemons, was that I was, I got back to writing, which I hadn't done extensively since I was publishing Good Day Sunshine for 20 years. And the 2 years of COVID, I was able to finish the book of top 10 horror lists. And that sort of said, well, this was so accepted and so received and so well reviewed that it only makes sense for me to do a version of it for Beatle fans who were saying, hey, how dare you put out a horror book before you did a Beatles book? But you answered it. I thought every topic was covered. What am I going to write about? All the people I interviewed at my Beatles conventions or my memories or experiences. Maybe my kids would be interested in that. Maybe you would as a fellow, fan and broadcaster, but I didn't think that was enough mass appeal. And then when the horror book came out, and, so many celebrities, rock stars, horror people, athletes, actors, they gave me their top 10 lists. I thought, well, there's certainly enough Beatle fans who, are in the celebrity world who will do the same. And I went to a similar pool, reached out to a lot of my old friends who helped me in the first book. And I went beyond that and reached out to a ton more, again, DJs and famous celebrities and pop culture icons, and said, hey, it doesn't have to just be songs. It could be Beatle albums. It could be solo things. It could be anything you pick. Give me a top 10 list. And for those who were not necessarily touring, or they weren't back to acting in films and had a few seconds to do it, a few days or a few hours, whatever it took, they came through, and I got some amazing lists. And I'm just really proud. The book of top 10 Beatles lists, it's not only being acclaimed by Beatle fans, who of course are going to love it, but people who love just general interest top 10 lists, celebrity books, and pop culture books. It's really spanning that globe of people who love the book.
How important was that, though, for you to say, come up with whatever top 10 list you want? You didn't narrow it down, and you got some amazing responses. Like Elliot Easton, I emailed you last night as I was reading this. I'm like,
that's the go-to,
this is
right?
the coolest thing. He came up with a list of top 10 Beatles middle eights. For those not familiar, what does middle eight mean? And what are some of the songs Elliot chose? I got the book up in front of me here if we need to go through them.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is a middle eight, for someone who's maybe not musical astute enough to know, is you get a normal pop song, And now it doesn't apply as much because songs now are just, long extended beats. But in the day, it was verse, chorus, then a bridge, a middle eight, which threw the song into a little different direction. And then it came back with either the verse, chorus, or chorus again. And Elliot Easton, who knows his music, realizes that's, Beatles songs really stood out. A lot of 60s pop did, but especially Beatles songs where it was a great song. And then there was that bridge, that middle eight, which was different than the rest of the song, fit thematically and sounded amazing. And some of the ones I have it in front of me too.
Yeah.
So, A Day in the Life, Things We Said Today. But the one that he cited as number one is This Boy. And that changes into, oh, and this boy would be happy just to love you, but I'm not. And that's the middle eight, which is different than the rest of the song. And when Beatle bands do that song live, that's the part that gets the accolade right in the middle of the song. It gets usually applause and sometimes screams because it's so different than the rest of the song. And the way Lennon sang it and screamed it was just so amazing. That's a perfect example. But Elliot Easton's top 10 list stood out, and I use that a lot when people say, oh, well, what did some of your celebrities pick that was different than just, 10 Beatles songs? And Elliot Easton's, who of course is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame guitarist from the Cars, his list definitely stood out for that reason.
This Boy came up a couple times, if not more. I noticed that come up twice, which is interesting because there's some real deep cuts here from the Beatles.
Yeah, good call. So what we did in the back of the book was we did an index where we listed every song that's mentioned in the book and who mentioned it. Carmen Appice, who was the drummer from Bill Fudge, Elliot Easton, Terry Sylvester, one of the singers from the Hollies, Rock and Roll Hall of Famer, and Gary Puckett, who's a great vocalist in the late 60s. Those four all you have included This Boy in their lists. So, that's a nice chunk of people who picked a great song.
And I believe yesterday that got the most mentions, 19 altogether.
Yeah, we're not going to go through all the people who picked it, but Leo Sayer and Cousin Brucey, Tommy Chong from Cheech and Chong. But you got to think that Yesterday is going to make the list. It's a song that was covered by more artists than any other song in the history of popular music. So it's going to get a few votes in there, no doubt.
Maybe the best of the 5-star reviews on Amazon comes from a fan, Steve Ludwig, who says he's a first-generation Beatle maniac. He says this book presents new Beatles stories and info that even the most diehard Fab Four fans would never have known before reading this book. Are there any stories or any pieces of Beatles trivia that come to mind from the book that you can share that maybe you didn't know about?
There are. I'll give you a hint to one of them is Cousin Brucey, who was a famous DJ, was on WA Beatles C in the day, and he's back on the air Saturday nights on the same station, tells about a conversation he had backstage, probably in the dugout with John Lennon before the Shea Stadium concert. I'll just give that as the hint for it because we want people to read the book. But Larry Kane is a reporter, an author, a journalist, an anchorman who toured with the Beatles, not as an opening act, but as a journalist. Him and Ivor Davis were the two journalists who joined the Beatles in 64 and 65. Ivor Davis being the British version of Larry Kane.
Ivor is a legend.
He was there when the Beatles met Elvis. And both of them have written books. Both of them are in this book with a chapter. But Larry Kane's article stands out. And a lot of people have told me that, just like Elliot Easton's, because he lists the 10 most impressionable, the concerts that stood out the most and why. And man, that's like a book in itself. His chapter is just really tops. Not to take away from everyone else's, because I don't think there's a chapter in the book, a top 10 list in the book, that isn't worthy and doesn't deserve its own, accolades. But those two, for some reason, stand out from the crowd.
Yeah, one was the San Francisco concert he referred to as the Rude Awakening concert.
Yeah, well, I mean, wasn't that their last concert? And it was a rude awakening for not just the Beatles, but for the fans, because until the rooftop, that was the last time you would get to see the Beatles live, and only people saw them on the rooftop were those few in London. And then, of course, when Get Back finally came out, or the Let It Be movie originally, until then, that was a big gap between, the Beatles' final show in San Francisco and then the last show on the rooftop.
I was just talking to my friend today, Chris. He's going to be listening to this because he said he would. I told him I'd be talking to you. He's a huge Beatles fan, and he knows the history so well. And I said to him, Charles talked to, I believe it's 3 guys from the Quarrymen. Now, you also spoke with Pete Best. So before we get to the Quarrymen guys, Pete Best, when did you first meet Pete Best, and how did you get him to be part of the book?
So Pete and I have been friends since the 80s. We met in Liverpool, and I met his mom. They invited us as part of the tour group on one of the early Beatle tours. We went to the Casbah. They had reopened it. We had a party there. I danced with Mona, his mom, became close with Pete, and invited him to come to America. And he was the first of my major guests who was ever at any of my Beatle conventions. We brought him back twice to New Haven when we did the conventions in the day. And then he came to shows in Columbus, Ohio, in Cleveland, in Philadelphia. I brought him to a ton of shows and actually represented him for a short while in the US. But we've stayed friends ever since, of course, and seen each other numerous times when we brought the fans over to Liverpool. And when I did the horror book, the book of top 10 horror lists, he gave me a list for that. And I thought, all right, great. Then getting a list from him for the Beatles book will be a breeze. Wasn't that easy. Well, I'll tell you, Eric, is some of the people really wanted to give a great list, and they didn't want to just throw something. And it wasn't as easy as giving a list where they wouldn't be judged as much. He puts together 10 horror movies and gives the reason why. All right, no one gives it a thought. Cool. One of the Beatles gave, Charles a list for the horror book. But if Pete Best is in the book of top 10 Beatle lists, it's got to be a worthwhile list. And it took him a long time to do it. But I got it both from him and his brother Rogue Best. And both of those are great in the book because I'm able to say we have a list from a Beatle. Well, we also have lists from the pre-Beatles. You mentioned the Quarrymen. It's 2 Quarrymen who were original Quarrymen and Quarrymen all through. But it's also Chaz Newby, who currently plays occasionally with the Quarrymen and was the first left-handed bass player in the Beatles, because Stuart Sutcliffe had remained in Germany, in Hamburg, and Paul McCartney was playing guitar or some piano, whatever the case may be, and they needed a bass player, and it was Chaz Newby who filled in for the Beatles on 4 dates. So we got Chaz's list in there. So we got Quarrymen, we got pre-Beatle Beatles, we got one of the Beatles in Pete Best, we got one of the Beatles brothers, we got one of the Beatles stepmoms, we got one of the Beatles sisters, we got 3 or 4 guys related to Badfinger, which was very...
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
Also, I thought a real great coup.
Yeah, because Paul and George had a lot to do with Badfinger. They produced and wrote songs for Badfinger.
Yes,
Yeah.
and the Apple label. They were they're in the book, as is Brute Force, who's one of the Apple recording artists that people forgot about. So it's a lot of those, famous people. Sure, Pete Best and Dave Winfield and Dick Cavett.
Yes, Dave Winfield and New York Yankees.
Right?
I love it.
And he gives a great list, and there's a picture of him with Paul McCartney in the book. But it's also those factoid type people who, if you're a sincere diehard Beatles fan, you're just going to go, wow, how did he get him to get in the book? So it spans the gamut of the diehards and the casual fans who are going to love it.
To follow up on Pete Best, the story that I've heard regarding Pete is, and I haven't read a whole lot about him, but it was difficult for him in the beginning because he was there and then Ringo took over and that was difficult. But then for a while there, it was difficult for him, but then he embraced it. And nowadays he's really cool with the whole Beatles history. He doesn't shy away from it at all.
Yeah, he's been coming to Beatle conventions for 40 years. He's been answering the questions for all that time. He put out a book called Beatle, the Pete Best Story. He's definitely embraced it, but don't forget when the anthology finally came out, they used a bunch of songs that he was on. So he got a little nice, bit of change, it's rumored to be, 4 million pounds. So he got his due finally. But, it's not that. It's the fact that he's so great with fans. He has a beautiful family, say wife, kids, grandchildren. The best family is loved, respected. They never left Liverpool. And they've since opened up a Beatles museum, the Liverpool Beatles Museum, which is one of the greatest, forget just Beatles, one of the greatest museums in the world. So he's such an important part of the Beatles fandom, part of Beatles history, and he's in the hearts of Beatle fans who've ever met him.
And from what I recall, he does tour, right? He's got his own band?
Yeah, there's the PS band where him and Rogue do the dual drums, just like Ringo and Greg Bissonette or whoever Ringo tours with. And it's always this top-notch band that plays not only the classic stuff that was played in the Hamburg and the Cavern and the Casbah days, the pre-Beatles stuff that the Beatles would do, but they put out an album, Hayman's Green, which is great. If you look that up, it's great pop music, a la, dare I say, Squeeze and Crowded House and all that. So yeah, Pete Best wasn't just a relic. He's continued to release music through the years with his brother, and it's great stuff.
Yeah, it's a great story. Let's talk about Greg Bissonette, because I'm a huge David Lee Roth fan, huge Van Halen fan. So Greg Bissonette was on Dave's first 3 albums, solo albums, and an amazing drummer. Yeah, amazing drummer. What a range. He can play any style you ask him to play.
Yeah.
He's played with so many artists, including Ringo. He's been in his all-star band.
Yeah.
He came up with the top 10 Beatles songs list and some interesting choices here. He's a big fan of The End from Abbey Road. He said, quote, way before drummers played with click tracks and loops, Ringo played an 8-bar drum solo here that locks with the tempo and never budges. You can set a metronome to it. I hear so many drummers that cite Ringo. Yeah, Ringo's an influence to a lot of drummers. Phil Collins comes to mind. Is there a song you would say, for you personally, that's Ringo's best, his finest moment?
You used best in the same sentence as Ringo, by the way.
Yeah, I did. Apologies.
No, all good, all good. First, let's give kudos to Bissonette. I saw him do a drum clinic in Connecticut at the Sphinx Temple in Berlin. I believe it was Berlin, Connecticut. And wow. First, the personality, the clinic itself, everything about him. Then he met everyone. He's a great, great guy. Greg, I'm going to send you the link to this. I love you. And he swears by Ringo. So here's this astute, learned, classically trained drummer who can play anything in the world and still says, Ringo's the greatest. And that's amazing. It's funny that I mentioned him prior because that gave you the perfect segue without knowing
yes.
about this and that, not knowing that you knew his history
yes.
and David Lee Roth and all that stuff. I guess, that middle, the part where Ringo was doing like Rain and Paperback Writer, that kind of stuff stands out. But, as silly as Yellow Submarine is, there's that boom. And then in the next one, it's boom, boom, boom. Then it's boom, 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 boom. Then it's boom, 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 boom. There's so much things that's not out front that if you analyze and separate Ringo's tracks, you go, what? And his timing is as good as any drummer that's ever lived. To this day, his timing, and he's a human metronome. It's amazing. So we give credit where a credit is due, because for so many years we're like, oh, Ringo, really? And the more you study Ringo and more drummers who came out in favor of Ringo, you realize that Ringo was a great drummer in his own right. Absolutely.
Do you know the one about Phil Collins saying that his nod to Ringo is on That's All, where it's that little fill, like it almost sounds like Ringo on the Suitcase. Yeah, Phil Collins said to listen for it. It's in there.
And someone reminded me that on the the mono play out to Paperback Writer, and I don't know if it's on drums or it's actually, there's a typewriter sound right at the end of it, which we forget about because we only listen to the CDs and we listen to the stereo and we listen to the remasters and all that. And so I don't think it's ever been asked whether it's an actual typewriter or if it's Ringo doing something special, with sticks.
How about some famous TV stars? Let's talk about them. A couple in the book. Lisa Whelchel. Am I pronouncing it right?
Sure.
It's Whelchel. Lisa Whelchel of Facts of Life. She played Blair. And Butch Patrick.
Eddie Munster.
I've seen every episode of the Munsters like 100 times.
Butch is a dear friend now. Our history goes way back. He was at a San Diego's Beatles convention that I was one of the MCs at, and he had his collection was on display and he was selling some stuff. And Eddie Munster is a big Beatles fan. Wow. And he's talked about it since he's put in his books and all that. And he's come to my Monkees convention. He's been a guest at my Beatles convention. And of course, he was in my top 10 horror list book. And he's in now the top 10 Beatle list book. But he also was a guest. You mentioned I do the Beatle tours to Liverpool. I also do Dracula tours to Transylvania. And Butch was on one of those tours, but he's always there for me. He's such a great guy, and his list in the top 10 Beatles list book is great. Lisa was not someone I knew, or not someone I knew how to reach, but I was on her show called Collector's Call on MeTV.
Yeah.
And I don't know when this is airing, but where this past Sunday I was on her show. I was the Monkees expert on the show, and the fan who had the Monkees memorabilia, I was assessing the value of her collection.
Okay. Now, when you say this weekend, was it filmed this weekend or did it air this weekend?
Aired. No, it filmed a while ago.
I got to check it out. Yeah.
It
Okay.
only aired this past weekend on MeTV. So that's when I had an opportunity to say, Lisa, I want your list. And so that's how I was able to get her list. So sometimes it's just circumstance, being in the right place at the right time. Had I not been on that show, had I not met her, I probably wouldn't have thought of her to get a list. Now, on the other hand, the other actress there's a few actresses, Mackenzie Phillips, but there's another actress, Dinah Manoff, who's in the book. And if you're a pop culture geek like I am, you know that she was in Grease, you know that she was in Soap. But what you don't know is she ran a Beatles fan club when she was a teenager or a youngster. And so that was the connection there. Once I found out that she had her own little Beatles fan club out of her house, whether it was, 5 people or just her friends or 20 people, I said, I got to reach out to her. And I got a great list from her. And, the fact that she was in Grease and Soap, and people might not remember the name, but when they see the photo and they see the connection, yes, of course she is.
I want to ask about Butch Patrick mentioning that the Beatles visited the Munster set. When was this?
He wasn't there. He
wasn't there. When was this? How much do we know about this visit? When did they show up?
I don't have a lot of details on it. He explains it in his book, and he's told the story numerous times, and shame on me for not remembering. But it's kind of similar to, unless there weren't pictures, unless there's pictures like when John Lennon visited the Happy Days set. People never knew about it till pictures came out. And, the actors of that were so happy that those pictures finally came about, because they're actually able to share it on their websites. A similar scenario, the Beatles loved that stuff. The Beatles loved the Monkees. And there were so many pictures of the Beatles visiting the Monkees and vice versa. But I don't think there's any pictures. I mean, wow, how amazing would it have been to have photos of John, Paul, George, and Ringo next to Herman, Lily, and Grandpa. That would have been amazing.
And remember the Munsters episode where they had that Beatles type band? What was the
Standells?
The Standells.
Yeah.
Real band, right?
Real band. Oh, yeah.
Standells. Oh, man.
So many, you're going to get me going here. It's a whole nother topic, but there were so many amazing 60s sitcoms where Chad and Jeremy, the Beau Brummels, the Standells, these guys would just, for no real reason. I think even the Gilligan's Island had, the guys couldn't get off the island, but a pop band was able to get to the island.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Charles Rosenay is our guest. Brand new book called The Book of Top 10 Beatles Lists. It's out right now. Some really cool deep cuts that make the list in the book. I want to go back to the members of Badfinger. Jeff Allen Ross, he was in Badfinger in the 1980s, right?
Yes.
He came up with the 10 overlooked and underrated Beatles songs.
Jeff Allen Ross is a great guy. I want to prelude this. And he is currently the music director for Peter Asher. So if you see Peter Asher live, you will see Jeff as well. So Jeff did a good job. I'm not convinced that Don't Bother Me and Not a Second Time are overlooked songs, because even though they're, not single tracks, they were never hits. In my opinion, any song that's on a Beatles album is not overlooked or underrated. But what he did is he took it a little deeper and went with the solo stuff. So like Arrow Through Me, Awaiting on You All, Junk, Isolation, Little Lamb Dragonfly.
Yeah.
He really gave it some thought. And I know he did, because he took months before I got the list. And you mentioned, he was in Badfinger for a little while. But we got Ron Griffith, who was in the Ivies prior to Joey Molland. We got Joey Molland, of course, who is Badfinger. I mean, he now carries the torch. The spirit of Badfinger is alive because Joey Molland is still out there touring. And then we also got this guy, Bob Jackson, who people forget when Joey was out of the band for a while. Bob Jackson was in the band, and Bob still plays as a Badfinger band, Badfinger UK or whatever, in England only. So yeah, there's 4 guys with Badfinger connections, and Jeff was one of them. And I'm glad you mentioned it because there's so many lists of just, my favorite Beatles songs. And then Elliot Easton does the middle eights. Jeff Allen Ross does the forgotten ones or the overlooked ones. So good job pointing those out.
Yeah, those are the ones I love. And the legend Dick Cavett. How did you get Dick to contribute?
We bow.
Oh, and can you talk about the list he came up with? I mean, here's a guy who he had members on his show. Legendary appearances by Lennon and Yoko.
Yeah, I think the takeaway from his list might not be the list, but what he puts after the list. He writes, and these are the stories I can tell. What kind of stories?
I love his humor too, the dry.
Brilliant, just a brilliant. His style of interviewing was so different than the Carsons and the Joan Rivers and every, Joey Bishop, whoever else was on late night. His was so on a different level. And the fact that he was able to get Beatles on the show and the Beatles trusted him to go on the show and they were friends of his. Dick Cavett was someone that I was trying to pursue for a lot of other things through the years, to be a guest at a Beatles convention. In 2014, was it? I did a 50th anniversary of the Beatles coming to New York and to America, and I did a series of concerts in New York. Geraldo Rivera was one of my MCs, Charles Grodin, the amazing Kreskin, all these people, were MCs at an event that had Al Jardine from the Beach Boys, Tommy James. It was a laundry list of rock stars doing Beatle tribute, and it was the 50th anniversary of the Beatles in America, called NYC Fab 50. New York celebrates the Beatles' 50th anniversary, and I wanted Dick Cavett so badly for that and couldn't get him. Bunch of things I asked him to contribute to, the Horror List book, so many things, and everything was, I would like to, but I can't, or he would like to, he can't, and it was always one reason or another, always legitimate reasons, but I thought I'm never going to give up. And for all the things that he was not able to do, this was more important to me and such a better contribution than any of the other things would have been. And his list in the book of top 10 Beatles list is so great that when people say, well, who's the proudest one you've gotten there? Yeah, I'm honored that John Lennon's sister gave me the forward, and Bill Harry, who we can talk about as if you'd like, the afterword, and Pete Best, and every list I'm proud of. For some reason, Dick Cavett adds that little more bit of maybe class or credibility to the book and brings it to another level. So thank you for mentioning him. He's somebody who I'm just honored to have in the book, and he's an American treasure. I wish he still had a talk show or came back to interviews.
Because he's still on his game. He's on the top of his game. He can still do it because I see him.
He appears on the list.
Yeah, and I see him appear. Every now and then he appears on something here and there, but I'm sure he's living happily in retirement these days.
And let's just do the clip of Forrest Gump, and it makes it all worthwhile.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, he's in that clip of Forrest on Dick Cavett. Yeah. I got to ask you about Rod Davis and Len Gary. Let's talk about those guys because you were talking a little bit about the Quarrymen. We'll talk about their part in Beatles history and maybe share a few of their top 10 list of Beatles memories.
Well, before there was Beatles, there was the Quarrymen. It was John Lennon's band. Before Paul came along, we were playing with the Len Garys of the world and Duff John Lowe and Colin Hanton, and they said Len Gary, Rod Davis. And these guys are still in Liverpool. They're still playing gigs as the Quarrymen every so often for special occasions. They toured America a few years back when they were a little younger, and they're all getting on in age. So it's tough to nail them down for something like this. In a lot of the scenarios, I had to do an interview the way we're doing this, and I had to ask them the questions. That wasn't the case with the two of them. It was the case with Joey Molland. It was the case with Clarence Frogman Henry, with Mark Hudson, where they didn't want to do the homework. They didn't want to sit down and write down. But if I interviewed them and then later transcribe, transpose, whatever, I would get the top 10 list. But both of those came through for me, and just really proud of it, because I'm not that close to those guys as I am a Pete Best. And so it was really, some of these were, shot in the darks. It's, you don't know me, I know you. I've seen you every year in Liverpool when I bring fans over. We met at St. Peter's Church. We met here and there. And I had to remind them how I kind of know them and what I am in the Beatles world of history. I am the unofficial ambassador to America for Beatle fans coming to Liverpool. So all those things kind of opened the door, and they probably knew the magazine Good Day Sunshine. So all those things gave me enough credibility to say, I would love to get a top 10 list from you. And the ones that were, able to do it and remembered who I was and all that came through. And those two Quarrymen were examples of, if I called them on the phone, I said, hey, this is Charles. It would be Charles who? Charles Rosenay. Oh, I know the name. What's it from? And I'd have to go deeper and deeper. So those are two situations of that where I really had to go deep. But once they came through, I think both their lists were really good. Rod Davis, his memories, hearing Lonnie Donegan's Rock Island Line for the first time, which of course was a big influence on all the Mersey bands at the time. The day his parents brought him a banjo, which led to him being in a band with John Lennon. The day he was asked to join the Quarrymen, the photo of the Quarrymen on Roseberry Street in June of '57 with John Lennon, the famous picture that has him and Lennon on the same, lorry going down the road at that famous event. And then his dad's photos of the Quarrymen on the back of the truck. And it's just the recording of the Quarrymen with John Lennon singing on a tape, and how they got to play the Cavern. It's, I forget about. Thank you for bringing that up. I'm thanking you a lot for some of
you for writing the book. Hey, you don't have to thank me,
because I forgot that there's so much stuff that's in the book that goes beyond the list. And if you're a Beatles fan, you're getting some history and you're getting some tidbits that aren't anywhere. He said you could have come. I guess John said, pity you can't play drums. You could have come to Hamburg and played with us. And he writes, another missed opportunity to become a Beatle. These guys we didn't think about were so close, to being a Fab Four or Fab Five. And of course, it was meant to be, the bigger picture. I always say the stars aligned when the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. But the stars aligned before that, because it was meant to be. Pete Best was a great drummer, a great personality, a great guy, but he wasn't a Fab Four. He wasn't the mesh for John, Paul, and George. And whether he sees it or not, it's the truth. Would they have gone as far as they did with Pete or not? I mean, that's a whole book. That's a whole speculation that we can talk about forever. I think they would have. But would they have been as happy? Would they have been as creative? They loved Ringo. They loved Ringo more than Pete. Why does somebody love a friend more and want to be with a friend more than another friend? Yeah, they were mates with and buddies with Pete, longer than Ringo, but there was something that clicked. And it proved. I mean, you look at the success. Look at the fact that we're talking about a band, 60 years later.
They did okay.
They did pretty decent. You either come out of Southern as a broadcaster and you do great that way, or you come out of private joke for us, or you come out of Liverpool and you become the biggest sensation that the world has ever had.
Yes, Charles and I are graduates of Southern Connecticut State University in New Haven. That's right. That's sure. Right. Let's talk Bill Harry. He created Mercy Beat, a newspaper in the early 60s focused on the Liverpool music scene. Can you share a few picks from the very interesting list he came up with, which has to do with the ladies in the Fab Four's lives? I love another great list, another product of you come up with whatever list you want. Yeah.
Right? Bill Harry, first of all, love him. Only met once at one of my Beatles conventions in Detroit that I was hosting. But Bill Harry and I have shared so much through the years. as he was writing books, I was reporting on them in Good Day Sunshine. As I was publishing this magazine, Good Day Sunshine, he was my English correspondent, and he would send me articles on all these bands that the world never heard of. And here I was reporting on the Beatles, and his article was talking about the Undertakers or the Mersey Beats or the Swingin' Blue Jeans, all these amazing other Mersey bands. And so I always, had a high admiration for him, because aside from that, he's the guy who reported on the Beatles in Liverpool before they were known. And he's the one who did those Mersey polls, which put the Beatles finally at number one. And I said, I'd love to have a top 10 horror list from you. And he gave me one after my book was published. So that's been put on the side. And if I ever do a volume 2 of that, he'll be in that. But it was the scariest places in Liverpool, by the way. He was even thinking out of the box for that. When I requested a list for this, I also asked him to write the forward for it. Gave me a great piece on that. And then he said, Charles, I'm going to give you an article which I think is going to be great as a top 10, but you might not want to print it. And I said, this is all an email. I said, Bill Harry, you could tell me the top 10 places the Beatles urinated on the streets of Liverpool, and I will print it. I will print anything. I didn't really say that to him, Eric. I'm kidding.
But I would too. I would say I would do the same.
I would have printed anything he gave me.
Of course.
And he thought out of the box, and he said, kind of the loves that got away, the top 10 Beatle gals who they never wound up married, but they had relations with. And you talk about these 6 degrees of separation. One of the gals he mentions, Bernadette Byrne, Byrne, happened to wind up marrying, she dated George Harrison, right? She was one of those cavern girls. She happened to marry Mike Byrne, who was a Liverpool musician. The two of them opened up the Beatles story, which was the first exhibition in Liverpool, if you want to call it the Beatles, a Beatles museum, so to speak. Went on to write a book about it. And that is currently one of the top attractions in all of England, not just Liverpool, the Beatles story. And if it wasn't for them, that might never have happened. So she's in the book, not only in Bill Harry's list as one of those, not birds, because we can't call them that, the 10 girls they left behind, but she's also in the book with her husband, Mike, giving a top 10 list. And they were both there at the time. So their lists are really cool because they knew the Beatles. They played in the same clubs as the Beatles or attended Beatles shows at the Cavern. And there's even a rare picture of her with George Harrison in the book. And there's a picture of Paul McCartney with Dorothy Roan.
That's the one. Yeah, I was going to say, you got some really rare photos in there. Yeah.
Who's in the book. So really proud of not just, we don't even mention this. There's amazing lists, but there's amazing photos. And I'm really proud of the photos that I put in from my collection, because I was happy, and lucky enough to meet so many of these people. And in the cases where I met them, I try to put in the pictures of me with them.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. How about Paul McCartney's sister Ruth, who gives readers a great look at historic locations in early Beatles history?
Yes. Places
that she remembered. And these are like old school sites. What are a few that stand out? A lot of them pubs.
Yeah.
A lot of them places to go drinking.
Places to go, knock one down, to have a Guinness or two. I loved her list because, again, it wasn't your top 10 Beatles songs. And nothing wrong with that, people who did that. But that was nice to get as a change. You read 2 lists of Beatles song lists, and then you find, oh, wow, she called it There Are Places I Remember, which is perfect. And it's the Beatle places she remembered. And a lot of them were pubs, but for example, the Empress, which is a place that you can definitely drink. We go there when we do our Beatle tours, but it was on the cover of Ringo's Sentimental Journey album. So that was a perfect tie-in to a great place. We can't just mention Ruth, who was Paul's stepsister, without mentioning Angie, who's Paul McCartney's stepmom. She married Jim McCartney. And her list is in the book too. She gave me a list in the horror book. You would never believe that.
Oh,
she gave me a list in the horror book too.
Yeah.
But hers were really special because what she did is she gave me her top memories of being, Paul McCartney's stepmom. how she first met with Paul, her cousins, all that good stuff. And then she went into her favorite songs. And we mentioned, yesterday, and that was her favorite. But she threw in some surprises, While My Guitar Gently Weeps and Act Naturally, whereas Ruth, again, gave her favorite places. And if you've ever gone on any of my Beatle tours, liverpooltours.com, some of the places that are listed are places that are still around and that we still go to. And of course, Penny Lane and the Cavern and the Casbah. But some that, somebody might not, think of right off the bat, a place called the White Star, where the Beatles, would meet after their gigs, or the Anglican Cathedral. And I don't want to give away like every bit of the book, but you're mentioning some really cool lists and some really cool people. And the fact that I have a McCartney in there and a Lennon relative and all these people that played with the Beatles, it gives the Beatle fans something to latch onto. But I think you mentioned Steve Ludwig, who gave me a nice review. Thank you, Steve, in the Amazon book. It's the fact that you're getting tidbits of information, and I think we touched on that earlier, that really haven't been in other books. And the fact that it's all in the same book that also has the fun part aspect of it, of the Beatle list, it's a nice addition to a Beatles library where, you've gotten all the histories and you've gotten all the biographies. Well, I think you're not expecting to get as much info and facts and surprising stories in a top 10 list book. So that's the bonus. That's the gravy with the book of top 10 Beatle lists.
64 people in all. One last one I want to ask you about before I ask you quickly about your own list.
Yeah.
No Soup for You guy. The Seinfeld fans know who this Larry Thomas, No Soup for You. How did he end up in this book, and what was his list?
When people ask me to think of the actors who are in the book, or the TV people, I always forget to mention him. My first go-to is Mackenzie Phillips,
Yeah, right.
time, because she also, Mamas and the Papas history. Larry Thomas and I were at the same convention in New Jersey called Chiller Theater. There's a Chiller Theater Expo, which I happen to be a guest at, upcoming April 28th, 29th, and 30th at Parsippany Hilton in Parsippany, New Jersey. I'll be signing copies of all my books. I'm also bringing Melanie, the famous singer from Woodstock, as a guest. She'll be there signing books.
Oh,
but
very cool.
When I put out the book of top 10 horror lists, I was a guest at Chiller. And in the next room was Larry Thomas. And I thought, wow, he's sitting there. He doesn't have a big line. Should I buy an autograph and ask him for a list? I just went in there and we talked for a while. He's such a nice guy.
Is he? Yeah.
He's not a soup Nazi. He's not.
And you have the picture of him with that look, that angry look.
Say, no top 10 list for you. He did not say that.
He didn't say that.
He said, can I do it when it's quiet and give it to you tomorrow? I'm like, yeah. Eric, he gave me a top 10 horror list, which will eventually go in the next book. And he gave me a Beatle list, pow. And he knew his stuff, right? He included the Abbey Road medley as one of his favorites. And a lot of group songs, but he threw in Isn't It a Pity?
Yeah.
And he writes a simple, honest, heartbreaking realization from George. That's really, how does he come up with that just sitting at a convention in between signing autographs? So yeah, he gave a lot of thought to his list and gave me a great list. I'm just so proud to have, so many great people in here. And when you talk about 64 different lists, I forget some of them. And when I do these interviews, it's the top ones that come to mind, but it's all the others that, deserve mentioning. So Larry Thomas, we salute you.
Oh, yeah. So let's finish out with your own list. What list did you come up with? And could you just share a few picks?
I wish that I worked on my list for a few years, because growing up, I would always be one of these nerdy kids who would do a top 100 songs of the year list, my top 10 favorite movies of the year list. I mean, literally, from when I was a little kid, I would do list. I said I could never do a Beatles list because I loved every Beatles song, and it would be like picking a favorite child. I thought I could never do it. But growing up, Here, There, and Everywhere was always the song I said would someday be my wedding song. Well, it was one of two. And the other one was a Monkey song because Davy Jones proposed to my wife on my behalf and played one of his songs. So at the wedding,
Whoa, wait a minute. How did this all play out? Tell us this story. Time out. How did he end up asking for you?
well, I'd known Davy Jones for quite a long time, and he was a dear friend. And
Oh man, yeah, God rest his soul. Legend.
yeah, legend. He'd been at my Monkey conventions as a guest. He was at a Beatles convention in Stamford, Connecticut as a guest in the mid-90s. And I knew he was appearing at Mohegan Sun at the Wolf's Den in Connecticut. And it was the time I was dating my now wife, and she came with me. One of my best friends, Mike Strito, at the time came with me. My dad was still alive. Four of us came, and I'd written a bunch of his email. I left a message on his phone, every possible way. Hey, will you propose to my wife on my behalf? At the show, I had no confidence that he got any of those because he was touring. It's very possible that he didn't check any of the above. So I left a note at his room. I left a note with the sound man. When he came on stage, I slipped another note to one of the members. And sure enough, before he played the song, I Will Love You Forever, he made a big announcement about his friend, Charlie, which he knew I didn't like to be called Charlie, but he felt, all right, he's my buddy, I can say it. He said, I hope he's done the nasties and gotten on his knees and proposed to his wife, which I hadn't yet. But then he said, Melissa, Charles wants to marry you. And she was all flustered and the crowd applauded. And it was really special. And one of my friends had recorded it. So we have a recording of it, which is really special.
That's
and
great.
Then he did a second late night show. And apparently he said, I don't know if Charles came to the second show too, but we're dedicating this to him and his new fiance, again, the second show. So we played that and Here, There, and Everywhere at my wedding.
That's great.
And through the years, somehow While My Guitar Gently Weeps has sneaked up on me. Every band that plays it, I'm like, yeah, this is the highlight of the Beatle tribute band show. And it was a song that growing up, everything was Paul with me, and John was second. And yeah, I love George, but none of his songs resonated with me except for maybe Something and Here Comes the Sun. But While My Guitar Gently Weeps was in that race. I just never knew it was in that race. It was behind all the others and somehow creeped up forward. So when I talk about my favorite Beatles songs, that's always up in the top. And the third of the three I list before I go into other reasons for picking other songs was And Your Bird Can Sing. And it's really funny because I managed a band called the Hoffners, my friend Mike Strito's band. And I was on a radio station a long time ago, WCCC in Hartford.
Oh, I was there.
Were you?
You were on the air there? I was on the air there too.
I was on the air as a guest.
Oh, okay. I was Fletch. I was the DJ Fletch in the mid-90s. Yes.
I don't believe it. That's so funny.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
I think it was the afternoon job.
You went to that building that was kind of dangerous area.
Correct. It was a terrible neighborhood.
Yeah. The program director, when he hired me for $5 an hour, he said, it was overnights, weekends. He says, park your car as close to the door as you can. I said, why? Oh, no. Nothing will happen. Don't worry. Just in case.
I remember it was one of the few times I actually put the club in my steering wheel.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
I went in and he goes, all right, so we're interviewing you about your Beatles convention. I'm going to play a song. What's currently the song that you want to hear more than any other song? And don't say And Your Bird Can Sing. Eric, that was the song I was ready to say. And I said, And Your Bird Can Sing. He says, you're only saying that because I said not to. I go, no, I love the guitar parts on it. I love that. I want to play that. Play that song. It's the one that no one ever requests. So that was always,
it's a great song. It is. It's such a great song. Well, I got to come up with my own top 10. I'm going to put a list, Spotify list. And I think Across the Universe might be my number one. And I know it's not, it's in your book once. Leo Sayer mentioned that. Yeah.
He's the only one who mentioned.
He's the only one, according to what I'm looking at here. Yeah.
That's very surprising. And had I done top 20, it probably would have found its way in there. It's really great. When my kids were very young, I put together discs called Beatles for the Kids. It was compilations, and it was the obvious stuff. Yellow Submarine, Maxwell Silver Hammer, She Loves You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah. The songs that I felt they needed to rudimentarily learn before I eased them into other stuff. But all together now and across the universe, we're on that first one.
It's hard, man, to come up with a top 10 list. You're talking the Beatles. Oof.
Oh, right.
Man. So the book just came out, the book of top 10 Beatles list. So people can get it through all the usual places. It's through Kiwi Publishing.
Yeah. Well, they're a Connecticut publisher, and they put out my in between my second book called True Ghost Stories of Connecticut. I sneaked that out in between.
I got to grab that book too.
The best place, thank you, I would love that. The best place to get the book, if you just want a regular copy, Amazon, free shipping, get it second day, however they do their magic. And it's easy to get. It's the book of top 10 Beatles lists. But if you want to get a signed copy and you want me to write, to Eric or to whoever's listening, and I autograph it and sign it, you can see me at a library, you can see me at a personal appearance, or you can shoot an email to book of top 10, the number 10, not TEN, book of top 10 Beatles lists at gmail.com. And the website is the same, book of top 10 Beatles lists.com. The other email is at Gmail.
And the tour too.
I got those mixed up. So the Beatles tour is www.liverpooltours.com. The email for the book is book of top 10 Beatles lists.com. The email is book of top 10 Beatles lists at gmail.com. I have so many library appearances. If you do go to the Facebook and you find Charles Rosenay, I'll usually list all my appearances. Like this record store day is coming up. On Thursday of this week, I'm going to be at Merle's Record Rack in Orange. On Saturday, I'm going to be at Exile on Main Street in Branford. And this is all Connecticut, of course.
Right.
But
Red Scroll. Red Scroll?
Red Scroll said no. They said no. Red Scroll in Wallingford. They said Record Day, that whole weekend is too busy anyway, that they couldn't do a signing. It's okay. No problem.
That's all right. Well, you are welcome back here anytime, Charles. Thanks so much. This was a blast.
Eric, thank you.
That's it. It's in the books.